Last week, we started a series all about a thing that is inevitable in a fallen and in a broken world, and also the thing that a lot of guys are notoriously terrible at. When we were going through this series about conflict, and we're doing it by talking about the various stages of what happens when you're in conflict with somebody else. So we talked about anger. That was the way that we started this last week, because the thing that often throws gasoline onto disagreement and makes it the fire of conflict, that's anger, right? It's when people start to get that heated feeling, and literally certain words that are translated in the Bible to anger have to also, or translated with their root words, to have to deal with heat. And we talked a little bit about all this last week. You can find this on the YouTube page, all that kind of stuff. But the next stage of what often happens within the process of conflict, when you're trying to, after you try to de-escalate yourself from anger, so somebody says something happens, whatever it is that has you in conflict with somebody else, you kind of try to de-escalate yourself from the frustration of it all. The next thing that we have to do might come easier to some people than for others, just like some people wear their anger a little bit closer to the surface than others. What we're talking about today is seeing the other person, seeing outside of yourself. And I mean this as much metaphorically, I mean it as much metaphorically as physically. Yes, you do need to see the other person, but my point is you need to be able to understand where the other person is coming from. As mentioned last week, our current world is fraught with conflict, and certainly we see a lot of angry people, right? We see a lot of people in conflict, and if you've ever been on the internet anywhere, any website, any comments section, if you've ever been to a comment section on anything on the internet, you know that it is very difficult for many people to understand why someone would come to a different conclusion than them. There is actually a post that I saw on Instagram. The algorithm gives it to me every once in a while. It says, "This is just proof that anyone will argue about anything." And then they have a picture and it says, "This is a rock." And one of the top comments was, "I mean, it looks more like a stone to me." And hundreds of my point is that we live in a world where we're familiar with disagreement, and it's very difficult for us to think about why someone else would come to a different understanding than us. We think that our experience in the world is the way that everybody experiences the world, and that's just not true. Right? And this is an important part of conflict. We need to be able to see the other person. And you're like, well, of course, I can hear their argument, right, Pastor Chris? I'm smart enough to understand what they're saying. Good job, but that's not the depth of what we're talking about. I'm asking, do you know why they feel the way that they do? Do you know why someone would choose something different than you, would lead them to the beliefs of why they are the way that they are? I'm not just talking about an argument of understanding where your spouse is coming from because it's your turn to make sure the trash gets taken out, or whatever type of thing. Picture the argument that really bothers you. Just keep it in your head. Maybe it's politics. Maybe it's somebody at work that drives you crazy. Maybe it's a neighbor that has a bunch of political signs, whatever that is for you, right? My question is, when you think of that person, do you know their perspective? Can you see why they are the way that they are? If your answer is, well, yeah, I understand why they are the way that they are, it's because they're stupid and wrong and against God and evil. No, right? Like, if that's the best that you can do, then you don't really understand that person, because all that I just did for that example is throw a bunch of labels on someone so that I don't have to look any closer. If you just label someone as something you don't agree with, that is just a method for you to hold someone at arm's length so that you don't actually have to love them. Right? And this is the way that we're taught to deal with conflict in a lot of ways. Well, I'm just not that person. You know, they're just different than me, and they're wrong and bad and evil, and I obviously am the one who's right. do you actually understand why they would be the way that they are? Here's an example. When I worked at Hope Des Moines, this was back before the Hope Elam days. We were on Ingersoll Avenue. We were closer to Central Iowa Shelter and Services, also known as CIS. And my job was the missions minister, and I was there to help head up a bunch of outreach efforts. We fed everybody breakfast every Sunday, and even though we were a relatively small campus at the time, we had multiple buses, and I know that some of you in here were involved with that effort. We had multiple buses of people coming in from programs like Door of Faith, places like Central Iowa Shelter. A lot of different folks, men and women, were getting bussed in to eat breakfast, and then were invited to stay for the service. It was a great thing that we're really proud of, right? And there were things that people needed that we as a small church campus at the time were able to provide. It was really great. The other thing that happened as a product of that is that we were seen as a place of resource. This still happens at all of our campuses, and especially on Ingersoll at the time, people would come in to try and receive financial support. Now, there's nothing wrong with asking for that. We at Hope have a great missions department and policies and procedures in place that we feel best help accomplish our missions effort in a faithful and sustainable way. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details here, but for the purpose of the story, you have to know that we have a system for connecting a limited amount of mission partners that we have every year, organizations that we work with, right? And we recertify them every year. We know them, we trust them, so that we send people there to have their needs met. Sometimes there's benevolence in certain circumstance from the church, but it's difficult for people in a situation of need to hear, hey, no, we're getting you to the person that can actually give you what you need. Usually what people are hearing is no. And that's all that they can hear. Being on the team there, I was a minister and I was a missions person, I got to have a lot of those meetings. That was part of my job. And it worked for me because my face always looks like this, right? My spiritual gift is I have an unsinkable ship, right? I just wake up, I haven't had any coffee this morning. I'm just ready to go. And so I had a lot of these meetings where we would talk with folks, and a lot of times people would get connected to somebody, and that was really great because they were able to then have a continued relationship with an organization that was going to help address the issues that somebody or their family might need. There was one particular situation where a gentleman was mad because I would not give him what he wanted. He was obviously struggling with a lot of things, a mix of circumstances in which he would benefit from a few of our different mission partners. But all he wanted to hear about at the time was whether or not I was going to give him money that very moment. And I explained that it wasn't going to happen. People think that we at Hope are sitting on a pile of money somewhere. I'm going to break that illusion for you right now. We are not. We in fact do not keep money at our campuses, right? And Bothers here, right? Yeah, we don't. I'm like, right? Yeah, we don't keep a lot of physical money on our campuses, especially not at a campus like Des Moines at the time that was just small. We send to the bank, take it elsewhere. So people who think we just have walls filled with money or a secret magical treasure trove somewhere, it just isn't true. I didn't even have money to give the guy. We didn't have literally a dollar in the building, and so I tried to explain to him some of these different things, and that, long story short, this guy walks out of the building screaming and looks at me in my face, and he's like, F you, man. You're from the devil. You are a failure at your job, and you are an embarrassment to people that do what you do. Just storms out. He's about trying to throw something. Right, one of the things that typically starts altercations, that starts a lot of conflicts in our lives, are when people need to escalate in response to someone else's anger, right? We have police officers here. How many times is an issue started because someone said something to someone else about someone's mom, or whatever it happens to be, right? People feel the need to escalate and respond to someone else. They think that is the only thing that they, especially as a man, are able to do, is to respond in kind. This gentleman stormed out and thankfully didn't key anybody's car or anything. But the point of the story is not to say that I'm some sort of sage or better than him. What I am saying is that I was a couple years into doing that job, and I had a lot of practice at that point of having those kinds of experiences, right? If I ever seem unflappable because you've told me something bad that's happened, it's because I have seen a lot of these types of things very early on in my ministry career. I ducked some rocks, right? I did literally ducked some rocks. My point is that I've had a lot of these circumstances, and therefore I had to practice seeing outside of my own circumstance to be able to see what somebody else was going through. Because a younger version of me would have been really mad at that encounter that I had with that guy. I was like, an embarrassment? What are you trying, to do the thing that a lot of us would want to do. If I didn't take a second, I wouldn't have seen that this person was scared. They didn't know what they were going to do. And that they, either through substance abuse or mental health struggles or both, I had been trained at that point to determine a lot of those things. They had a compromised ability to have a clear grasp on his emotions. So that had to also be really terrifying. His response didn't have anything to do with me, right? If I take all of that into account, if I chose to respond to that, it would have been more of a reflection of my own insecurity than it would have actually been about trying to resolve any of the conflict. But this is what happens for so many of us that seek to try to be better at dealing with conflict, but then somebody says something or there's something that happens, right? Side note, it's funny to think about the amount of people in the world that are fighting when all they're really mad about is themselves. That was more of like a physical altercation situation, but the altercations that many of us deal with on the regular probably have more to do with internal struggle, right? Whether it's at work or whether it's at home, maybe it's at a friend or a family member. Somebody says something you don't like, or there's tension in some way, shape, or form. You engage with Midwestern conflict, which is passive aggression. Everybody's really nice the whole time. Before you allow the one thing that somebody says in your day to replay at 3 a.m., anybody else, right? Before that one thing that somebody says ruins your entire day, or that you just sit up and you're thinking about it the entire time, before you allow some passive aggression to be the thing that lives rent-free in your head, think for a second about what that other person might have going on. Why were they so amped up today? Why might they feel a little aggressive? What else do you know about them that might lead to the struggle that they're experiencing? If you know nothing about them, then maybe that's a good place to start. No, you don't have to be everybody's best friend, but you can't pretend that you know that someone's evil if you don't know what their life looks like, right? I think I have a slide that says something to that effect. You can't say someone is evil. You can't write somebody off if you don't know what their life looks like. My point is that out of relationship is where healing happens. It's exactly what Jacob was saying in his prayer. We get to come together to do this. We get to live as brothers in the world. And one of the things that often helps people to heal is when somebody else sees them. Here are some things that are going to allow us some very practical steps to do this, and then we'll get into a little bit of a story of how Jesus dealt with some things amongst some of his followers. But here are some things to remember. The first thing is that no one thinks they're the bad guy. And I mean this literally, no one in the history of the earth. No one has ever been like, you're right, I'm the supervillain. What's the thing that happens in all of the superhero movies, right? The villain thinks that he's justified in doing what he's going to do. He or she, and nobody thinks that they are the antagonist. Everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing. So it's important to remember that if someone has wronged you, they did not do it because they have decided to be your nemesis. They have their own reasons and proclivities and decisions that they've made that have led them to where they are. Even somebody like Judas, who sold out Jesus of Nazareth, We believe that he was likely trying to, he probably thought he was helping. That's the really sad thing. And we think because of the way that he died by his own hand, it's believed by most scholars now that Judas thought by forcing Jesus to confront the Romans that he would be forced into action of taking the throne. Judas was just impatient. He was like, well, I obviously got to speed this along, so hey, maybe I tell somebody where he's at. That confrontation happens, and I mean, he's not going to die. He's the Messiah, right? And then he did. And my point is that even the person who has something against you isn't sitting there plotting their revenge. Not everybody, no one thinks that they're the bad guy. Okay. The second thing is if you're wondering what somebody is thinking about you, the answer is that they're probably not. I think about this all the time, and this is such a freeing thought, okay? If you're wondering what somebody is thinking about you, the answer is they probably aren't. They just aren't. And that is a freeing thing, friends. You are the main character in your own main story. And everyone else is the main character in theirs. That's great. But when it comes to conflict, how much conflict, friends? Well, how much of it has to do with an insecurity that we harbor regarding ourselves, when we can put to rest a lot of these thoughts of, well, what will somebody think of me if I lose this fight? If I give in here, I'm going to be seen as soft. What if they don't know that I'm right? What will people think of me? They're not. They're not going to sit and think about what they think about you, because they're already thinking about themselves too, worrying about the same thing. And also, going back to that phrase of losing, if I lose that argument, the third thing is you can't win a conflict. Can't do it. Yes, technically, if someone admits they're wrong, then you're the winner or something. But if I tell you that the world is flat and you tell me that it's not, technically I'm wrong, right? But when two people get into the point of true conflict within each other, which we defined last week as like the devaluing of another person. If you're like, that person is bad, I am against you, that's sin. We talked about this the last week. If it gets to that point, you've both lost. And how many times have you won an argument and lost? Because you either said the thing that you knew would hurt the other person, or you escalated it too far and it became all of a sudden that you were the bad guy. Maybe you weren't before, but you certainly were by the end of it. Right? When people have reduced themselves to that point and you've made somebody else the representation of everything that you hate versus the person that God made them to be, everyone has lost at that point. So reconciliation, taking the point of grace, taking that bent towards conflict resolution, that's not losing, because you've already lost with conflict. The point is, where do you get healing from there? And then here's my final point, and I put it in big words so we could all see it. It's not about being right. It's about being like Jesus. That's grace and love, in case you wonder what the being like Jesus part is. And we can be ready to testify as to what is right, but if my behavior, right, like you're like, well, Chris, we got to stand up for the gospel. Absolutely. We can testify as to what is true and good. But if my behavior steps past the character of Jesus for the purpose of an argument, it's become more about my pride than it has about God. Right? Even if you're quote unquote right, if you step past the character of Jesus, of showing up full of grace, full of patience, full of love, if it doesn't look like that, even if you're quote unquote right, it's become more about you than it has about God or about the truth or whatever you're going to try to convince yourself that it is. So Jesus knew that he was right when he sacrificed himself to defeat sin and death, right? If we want any example of somebody being right and allowing themselves to take a different path, Jesus knew he was right, and that people were wronging him, but he sacrificed himself. And even before that, one of the things that I think is fascinating in the Bible that's often gets lost is that Jesus' followers were from groups of people that would have been very ideologically opposed to each other. You had working class fishermen. You had a more extreme zealot, right? Maybe even a couple. That was an actual group at the time that was going to take a militaristic approach to taking down Rome, right? And then you had the tax collector, which was the guy that had sold out his people and was charging extra so that he could live. Just think about the zealot and the tax collector for a second. They were supposed to be in the same group. In another area of life, the zealot would have just killed the tax collector on sight. That happened. That's what they did. And all of these different groups of people were Jesus' disciples. Jesus is like, hey, follow me. And so I'm not going to show the clip for time's sake, but there's a moment in The Chosen where Peter, who has just been named Peter, the rock, right? But a lot of people know him as Simon. Simon Peter has just, he's having a really hard time dealing with Matthew. Because in this story, in this adaptation, he had an issue with Matthew in the past. But regardless of whether or not they knew each other beforehand, which they probably did, it was they lived in the same area. But he was like, he sold out all of our people. What am I supposed to do? Just like forgive him? Do you know what he did? He's like, my family could have died because of what he did. He's against our people, and you're just going to let him walk with us? Like, where does justice come in? He asked Jesus. He's like, am I just supposed to forgive somebody? And Jesus is like, yeah. And he's like, well, how many times? It's like if I just do 7, and they get into this argument, and he's like, no, not 7 times 7. And in the clip, it's really funny that Peter goes, well, I'm sure I could stack up the offenses, so we could probably get to that number. And Jesus said, no. 7 is the number of completion. It's the number of perfect. Perfect, 70 times 7. Perfect times perfect. Jesus is saying there is no end to the amount that you should show forgiveness and love towards somebody. Without end. And Peter asked him, he's like, how? He was like, he goes, why is it so hard? And Jesus said, well, man makes it harder than it has to be. We lean on our own understandings. And so Peter gets up and he's like, fine. He gets up and he's like snapping a stick. He's like all mad. And Jesus is just sitting there smiling because there's Peter leaning on his own understanding. Right? Jesus tells Peter as he rants about Matthew, everything you're saying that he did wrong is true. He doesn't tell him that he's wrong, but he does also tell him that, Peter, do you remember you're not without sin? And he reminds him of what Jesus has done for him. He said, well, do you remember what happened after that? And he thinks about the miracles. He remembers what Jesus has done for him. The invitation is the same for us. Whether we're having trouble with conflict, we can try to understand the other person. We can seek to forgive, and we can remember what Jesus did for us. Maybe you look like Simon right now, breaking a stick out of frustration, but God's love, God's perfect love, is given for us. We can let go of the transgression that we're feeling, trusting on the strength of God and realizing that it isn't all about winning, it isn't all about us, but passing on the grace and love that Jesus gives us to be. That will lead to a lot more peace and to who God is leading us to be. Because we are created for more than anger, and we are certainly created for more than just seeing our own side of things. So seek to understand out of relationship, reaching out to your fellow brother, your fellow sister, and loving people well. Amen? Okay, some discussion questions for us. When was the time you were forgiven for something? Right? Maybe you were stealing gum as a kid. Maybe you broke a window as a teenager. Maybe you cheated on a test. You crashed your dad's car, whatever that is. My point is, we often focus on how things are going to be made right to us. Well, how is somebody going to justify this to me? But I think it's important as we start this conversation. When's the time that you were forgiven for something? Right? What is that for you? Second question, what is a time When is a time you were forced to see from someone else's perspective? Maybe you got a job that you don't usually do. You gained some appreciation for somebody that usually does those tasks. Maybe you had a recent struggle with health that is something that other people deal with, and you're like, wow, that actually is really hard. And you see what life looks like for them. This act of seeing from someone else's perspective is a skill that we can practice. So I think it's important to identify the ways that we can do that well. And then 3, thinking about someone else in your life that you find that you've been in conflict with. How can you take time to pray for them and consider their perspective and their life? It is impossible to honestly pray for someone and be angry with them. Your heart can't take both. So if you're really frustrated with somebody, how can you take a second and just pray for them? Honestly, I hope they're doing well. I hope their family's blessed. It does something to your heart, trust me. Give it a try. And if you don't know enough about them, if you are in a conflict with somebody and you're like, well, yeah, that person, whatever they got going on. Okay, hey, if you don't know enough about them to pray for them and try to understand their perspective, what does it look like to get lunch with them? Grab coffee. I know that sounds insane, but if it's appropriate, making that effort heals a lot of wounds because some people just need to know that somebody else cares. Just a thought. Amen? Grace and peace, friends. Go be good to each other, and we'll see you next week. Okay?